Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to welcome Mya Rose-Craig. She is one of the youngest British people to be awarded an honorary doctorate. Activist and campaigner, she founded Black to Nature, focusing on minority communities. She's currently hosting a podcast, Get Birding, on no surprises here, on birding, with a host of celebrities and conservationists. And we're here to talk about birding, her life, and what's happening in the world. So thank you. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. So I'm a real city dweller, and I kind of think in this maze that is London, we have, some birds, these green spaces, but I think it's kind of not the same necessarily as getting out into the countryside and nature. I was wondering, could you give us a sense of the joy of watching birds in the wild, particularly for those of us who maybe haven't experienced it before, or how it kind of came to be that you became so passionate about this area of nature?
Yeah, so I think like nature's always played a very important part in my life. My parents are bird watchers and my older sister was a bird watcher and they've always taken me outdoors. And I live in the countryside. But I'm also half Bangladeshi and as I got older I really started becoming aware that there was just no one that looked like me in the countryside out in nature, and that was really upsetting. And I think like and that's kind of why I started doing activism, really. It was because of that magical feeling that I had when out in nature. So when I was little, it was always very fun and very exciting, and my parents were very good about making it into like a treasure hunt for me or something like that, where we were going to go and find the next bird. But I think as I've gotten older, I've really gained an appreciation for just sort of the peace that you get when you're outside, because you're separate from the stress of everyday life. You're separate from sort of the hustle and bustle of everything. It's just you and the outdoors. And I think that that's a really unique feeling that everyone should be able to appreciate.
I guess in popular culture, there's been a strand of thinking that kind of makes fun of bird watching or birding, and I guess there's been this sense, so you mentioned it, that it's been very kind of old white man dominated and maybe a bit anarchish. I mean, what you might say to those who might want to experience this joy you described earlier, but maybe the sense that this is not a community for them.
I mean, the funny thing is that the stereotypes aren't entirely wrong in that I can think of like 100 people off the top of my head who like completely slot into that. But that's just like one tiny, probably quite fanatical subsection of a really large group of people. And they are the ones that would go out and say, I am a bird watcher. But there's lots of people who would never really think of themselves that way, who are in fact bird watchers. Like if you have some bird feeders up in your garden that you like watching, sometimes you're a bird watcher. If you notice the birds flying over as you walk to work, you're a bird watcher. And I think for me, what like the word birder really means is just someone who is aware and appreciating the nature around them. And I think that that's something that a lot of people enjoy when you peel that label away.
So your suggestion is actually we're much closer to it in everyday life than we might actually think.
Definitely. But I also think that um that stereotype does make people feel like they aren't green enough, if that makes sense. Like one of the reasons I started my podcast was just because a lot of people said that they felt a bit too intimidated to get into bird watching because everyone seemed to know like they knew everything and they didn't even know where to start. Well, I've always stuck more with the viewpoint that like you don't need to know the names or the Latin names or the calls off by heart. You just need to go out and appreciate it. But I also think there's so many different ways of enjoying nature and the outdoors that we don't really like traditionally think about in the UK. Um, so I guess that typical way of engaging with nature is putting your binoculars on, putting your anorak on, going down to the local nature reserve and staring at some small brown birds for a few hours. And I'm not going to lie, personally, I do enjoy that. But there are a lot of people who don't. And one of the big things that my organization, Black to Nature, does is just sort of widen that perspective of what engaging with nature is in the first place. If you're playing football with your friends in the park, you're in the green space, you're still engaging with nature. If you're like, I don't know, feeding the pigeons during your lunch hour, we might not think of them as nature, but they are other animals and that's still nature. And I think as soon as you broaden that perspective, it takes the stress off and it makes you appreciate just how much nature there is around you, basically.
Yeah, I had a moment like that earlier this year where was on the banks of the River Thames, which not in London. You don't sort of think about that, but you can walk on the foreshore, and there's all sorts of nature around that, even in the middle of the city. Um, I was wondering, do you have any favorite, I guess, birding moments or experiences, something which you kind of feel was kind of pivotal in finding your enjoyment here?
Um, I mean, I think that there have almost been like, this is very corny, sorry, but genuinely, like, I think there have really been like a countless amount of moments that I have loved over the years. That I think when I was a child, there was a real just wonder still, when looking at everything. Like, I loved watching a super rare bird that had flown across from America as much as I enjoyed watching the dunnocks hanging out in my garden. And I think that that was just really magical because everything about birds and nature was exciting to me. Um, but I think like sorry, my charity Black to Nature, we run nature camps for kids
Hmm.
from minority ethnic backgrounds, and we're bringing them out into nature quite often for the first time ever. And I think, like, as someone who's always spent time outdoors and always spent time in nature, I think that really opened my eyes as to how um, just amazing, what an amazing experience that is for people to be experiencing the countryside for the first time, because a lot of these kids are having such a good time and they're again filled with that sort of wonder that you are when you're a kid. And I think like being able to relive that sort of childhood magic of being outdoors over and over and over with all of the kids that I work with is really special.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I've noted the same in some business people who I meet with, where if they do reconnect with nature into some way, it often kind of changes the way they view things, and you see the impact of what we do or our companies and things have on the world, and you can see that through kind of like reconnecting with those elements around us. Um, so I learned some specific birding words recently, which I didn't know existed or what they were. And I was wondering whether you could tell me from them from your point of view. So one is a kind of technical thing, which is tell me about ringing, because I believe this is something that you're qualified to do from quite early on. And what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, so ringing or banding in America is basically scientific study. So what licensed ringers do is they catch the birds in some shape or form. They take lots of different measurements from them, like weight, like how much fat they have on them, how much muscle, how I don't know how long their wings are, how old they are, stuff like that. And they log all of that data, and then they put a ring, a metal band round the leg of this bird, and it has a unique number on it. And that means that when another ringer catches the bird at some point, they'll be able to access all the data that we've logged about it before. So basically, we're building up this massive database on information about birds. And we learn all sorts of interesting things about loads of different species. For example, it's been really important just in terms of figuring out where birds go when they migrate, which we know a lot less about than people think we do. But personally, I started it when I was very young. I was 9 when I first started going and just sort of watching and wanting to take part. Um, and the personal appeal for me was just being able to physically handle wild animals and just see birds at a completely different perspective. Because obviously, we're not hurting them or even particularly stressing them out when we're catching them. But it means just for like 5 minutes or less, I'm able to sort of look a wild bird in the eye. And it's really special. I really love it. So in the UK, you can get your license when you're 16 So as soon as I was 16, I got my ringing license. And I've been doing lots of ringing since. This morning, I was actually doing raven ringing. I ringed, I think, 5 different raven chicks this morning, and it was really nice. So yeah.
Excellent. So, if you, what can you tell us about migration, or what I guess ringing has told us about that? Is there some unsolved mystery that you would think, you know what, it would be really great if someone solved this? Did you know that we don't know where these birds go or how they fly?
Well, migration is just a bit weirder than people think it is. So, for example, things that we would have thought historically have been that seem very obvious have actually been disproved. So, if we talk about blackcaps, for example, they're a relatively common UK bird. You get them in hedges and gardens and just in the countryside. And you get ones that you get in the winter. And the assumption would be, oh, just like lots of other birds in the UK, they're here in the winter, they stay, they breed, they live here year round. But it turns out that there is a population of blackcaps that migrate to the UK every winter, and then they leave, and there is a separate population of blackcaps that migrate to the UK every summer. So you've got weird things like that going on, that we just never would have realised otherwise. But there also were just genuine mysteries. So, for example, the cuckoo, which is like a very famous spring bird in the UK, for a really long time, we just had no idea where it was migrating to, what its migration route was. And it was probably only 10 or 15 years ago that we finally found out that they're migrating to the Congo, of all places. And again, like, we're discovering all of these things to do because of ringing.
That's amazing. I recall reading somewhere that we're not sure how birds do their complex navigation, because you have birds who that they know where to go back nesting, and they've never been there before, like if they're in their first year of life, and you can partially confuse them if you move them from their nest and things, and we're still discovering things about that. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I don't know, like, I'm not an expert or anything, but I do know that bird navigation, or just birds in general, are really interesting. Like, I think it's sort of a very, very normal, like, human thing, but it's always a human assumption that we are the cleverest and we have the
Yeah.
most skills and things like that. But birds can do so many fantastic things, and there's loads of different hypotheses. So, for example, people were trying to figure out if birds are literally just using landmarks to figure out where they're going. Um, some people think that it might be like magnetic forces that are basically creating like a little compass inside their head so they know where they're going. Whether it's just like a generational thing, they're showing each other the journey. Um, we're not 100% sure. There's loads of great ideas. They might all be true. Um,
Yeah,
and
I was
yeah.
reading. I think just this week there was a paper out showing that the crow family has human-like intelligence. It's just we need to ask them the right kind of questions. We don't know how to speak in their language, so to speak.
I love that take because I actually, for various reasons, I ended up like researching quite a lot about ravens last spring, and it was so interesting. And it was partially because there was a raven nest near my house, that suddenly popped up during lockdown. And I was suddenly very interested about ravens, and there were so many fun facts where I was like, these birds are so, so smart. Um, like, for example, even just the fact that ravens have fun, like they do things purely for enjoyment. I love that. Um, or they're social, the way that they interact with each other socially. But I think like the thing I found most interesting is the fact that ravens have been proven to use tools, which is interesting just because sort of tools is one of the way that we as humans and maybe like chimps differentiate ourselves from other animals in terms of intelligence. So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting. But corvids are brilliant. They're great birds.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And so I'm going to put you on the spot here as well, because I don't know necessarily you're going to know anything about this, but I realized I know nothing really about birdsong. So I was wondering whether I know birdsong, sometimes they kind of used kind of for social learning and also kind of for communication, and is also one of the things that we hear around. Um, what would you have me know about birdsong and why it happens, or anything about it?
I also didn't know anything about birdsong until I did an episode on my podcast about it because
Yay! So we should all listen to that.
yeah. But like genuinely, I didn't know that much before. I've never been like a birdsong person. I only knew a few songs. But I was talking to someone who is a birdsong person and called Lucy Lapwing, and she was saying that a lot of the times, like especially during springtime, a, well, what we hear as being very beautiful birdsong is really a very sort of macho display from various birds as they all try to prove that they're the strongest and the most resilient, and they're the ones that the female should go with. And they can get very, very territorial about it all. And it's the same with the dawn chorus, which again, we're like, oh, the dawn chorus is so beautiful. But all these birds are like shouting over each other again, trying to prove that they've made it through the night.
They're the loudest.
They were strong enough to last through the cold, and they're here to survive the next day. But one thing I did read about recently, which I thought was really interesting, was just talking about how scientists were measuring birds' brainwaves while they were sleeping, and how the brainwaves were doing the same as what they do when they are singing, basically. And these birds were dreaming about the songs that they sing or their calls that they make during the day, which I thought was really interesting.
Great. So I've got two more birding phrases or nouns that I've heard about. So what is it to the expression lifer mean in birding?
So for lots of birders, birding is all about lists. Like not in that it's all about the list, but it gets very competitive and they keep lists of what they've seen and what like they're aware of what they haven't seen, and you keep like a country list and a local area list, a world list. And like I said, it's all very competitive. And so a lifer is basically just a bird that you have never before seen in your life.
Right.
So it's a life tick, a life, a new bird in your life, I guess. But the sort of undercurrent to all that is like, yes, got another bird on my list. Yeah.
Great. And then the last phrase I heard or read about was pish, which I believe is a kind of sounds that some birders can make to attract birds or something like that.
Yeah, I would love to know where you heard that because I've never even seen that word written down.
Right. And
Sound.
then you made it up, like doing my research on birding.
Because
maybe it's a myth. Is it a myth?
No, it's a real thing, but I can't even do it very well, so this is going to be very embarrassing. But pishing is basically birders making a funny sound that makes the birds around you go, "What's that funny sound?" So they hop out into the open to try and figure out what that funny sound is. And weirdly, there are not many sounds that do this. Pishing is one of the few that pretty much always works, at least with certain types of birds. And this is going to be very embarrassing now. But it's basically like a psh, 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 like over and over, louder and quieter. And for some reason, it always gets the birds out. So
there you go. There's a scientific paper in that. Why are the sounds of maybe that's like the proto bird language, which we haven't understood yet. And is one of the things. It's like, they're asking us about the meaning of life. That's interesting. I'm gonna find out about that.
Yeah, it's funny because pishing is a very like age-old birding tactic. Like people are probably doing it in like the 60s to try and get birds to hop out of bushes, even back then.
Yeah, that's the other thing about, I guess. I guess there's some thought about birding being a particularly kind of British occupation, although I've seen that there's global birders, and there's been quite a long tradition that goes back this century, but it seems to go back even further in kind of nature writing. That is kind of this long tradition of being close to nature and things. And I guess there's also been a tradition of nature writing in this country. Continued by the likes of, I guess, Robert Macfarlane now, and sketching back, I think we've had people like Roger Deakin talking about wild swimming and things like that. Are there any particular books or works that have inspired you? Because I know you're somewhat of a writer as yourself.
Yeah, I think interesting. Stephen Moss wrote a really interesting. Stephen Moss, who is a nature writer, wrote a very interesting column in the Guardian maybe a year or two ago about nature writing and the British legacy of nature writing, because he was basically asking, in the UK we have this really almost important tradition of nature writing, but is that now outdated, and do we need something better to represent the British public? Which I thought was very interesting. But in terms of
Be nature YouTubing.
yeah, but I think a really good example of like that new type of nature is Dara's book, Diary of a Young Naturalist, which obviously everyone adored, and but with good reason. It's a really good book and it's really beautiful. And I think most importantly, sort of touching on what Stephen Moss was talking about, is also really accessible. Like it helps you to understand why he loves nature so much without the assumption that you are also an expert in nature, or you have also spent your childhood wandering through the idyllic countryside, And I think that's where things are going in the future. I also really love Stephen Moss's writing. But yeah, you're right. I think nature plays an unusually strong role in sort of our sense of place and our sense of national identity within the UK compared to most other countries, and that's a very historical thing. Like, not to go slightly off piste, but during my A levels, I had to study various like Victorian poets and things like that, and there was one that was like it was someone who was living in India, and he had painted this like beautiful idyllic picture of the English countryside with the country manners and this rolling green fields. And I was like, that's what people think of when they think of the UK. That image is so strong within how we identify ourselves, I guess, even for people that have never even been to the countryside.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I don't really know why, but it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about connecting to current and future generations, through writing or through some new forms of writing, it's definitely, I think, one way we could do that. So definitely recommend those books. But I think you've helped edit or collate a book yourself recently with a lot of other kind of young voices connected to nature. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I have a book coming out in September called We Have a Dream, and it was something I actually really loved writing. It was very special to me, and the idea was essentially there are so many amazing young activists around the world, especially young activists of color or young Indigenous activists, that are just not getting the platform and the promotion that they deserve for the amazing work that they do, and that I wanted to, I suppose, give them that opportunity to talk about the work that they were doing. And there was amazing range of the types of things, and there were people from literally all over the world. And so I spent about 6 months interviewing all of these different people, and it was fantastic. And you went from like really great grassroots, or what was once a very grassroots project that has become very big. There's a boy tackling deforestation via football in Kenya, to like very broad sort of system changing projects like Autumn Peltier in Canada, who's fighting for Indigenous people's rights, and especially to do with water. And I don't know, it was just amazing to speak to all of these young people about what they're doing, because they're all so inspirational, and a lot of them are like younger than me. And it was just, yeah, it was fantastic.
Well, now you know how other people feel when they look at you and you're younger than all of these others. That's it. There's always kind of someone younger than you, and there's always someone who kind of knows more than you. But that's okay. That's all good too. So do you have a particular maybe process as a writer? What does kind of a good writing day look for you?
Um, I think honestly, like writing, because I'm also writing another book at the moment, which is much more of a traditional like book. But writing this book, We Have a Dream, was actually a really pleasant experience, in that it was very structured, and I was literally just recording the Zoom interviews with people because, we're living in the age of COVID, recording these Zoom interviews with people and typing up a profile about them afterwards. And I guess the most difficult thing really was like reducing these amazing conversations down to like
just a few hundred words or
yeah, because these people were fantastic. But I think in terms of what a day in the life, like in terms of writing, looks like, very messy, very disorganized. Writing whenever I have the time or the energy, basically, which can be all over the place. I have um actually just the once, but I have jumped out of bed one morning being like, I'm going to write now. But more common, I've also stayed up very late suddenly with the energy to write. So I don't know, it's been a really nice experience, very different.
Great. And then on non-writing days, I guess, what does a typical kind of birding day look for you? Do you sort of get out and you've got a place to go to and some birds on a list or an idea of what to spot, and are you out there for a few hours with binoculars or eyes and things, and how does one of those days look?
I think it's totally flexible depending on what the goal is. Like, not to be annoying, but I think so. Quite often in lockdown, I've been doing a lot more like bird watching. So just going out on a walk for half an hour, for a few hours, just walking through, fields and woods and stuff, seeing whatever birds I happen to stumble across. Which I didn't do that as much before lockdown. I think that that's definitely something that I've grown sort of an enjoyment of, a patience of, much more than before. And I think that's more what I'm talking about when I'm saying how I feel like nature is very meditative and how it's very peaceful and things like that. But there are also certain occasions where a very rare bird has turned up in the UK. Those are not peaceful days.
Right.
When my parents are getting up like at like 3 o'clock.
We've got to go 100 miles this way.
Yeah, drive across the country to catch this bird just as the sun is rising. And hopefully to see it immediately and to celebrate seeing this new bird. And that can take between a few hours to days. There are occasions where we've gone back over and over to try and see a bird until we finally have. So, yeah.
Like famous celebrity spotting, but famous celebrity bird spotting.
Yeah, basically.
Great. And you've had some great travel adventures, because I think you've seen like loads of birds around the world. I think I was reading. Did you go to East Malaysia, Borneo once? Did you spot any birds there, or did I can't remember whether I misread that.
No, you did. I'm very lucky. I've been to all sorts of countries. I've traveled quite a lot for birds, which we travel for birds to see birds, and anything else we do along the way is just an extra. So when I went to Borneo, Malaysia, I certainly did see an awful lot of birds. Actually, it was a wonderful trip, and it was actually one of the, except Bangladesh, it was the first time I'd ever bird watched in Asia as well, or ever really been to Asia. And yeah, it was a really special experience. It was very different. But yeah, more importantly, the birds were fantastic.
Okay.
There was so much rainforest.
Well, I ask because it's one of the places that I've been to. But when I was in Borneo, I think there probably were sort of birds in the jungle, and I remember one or two. But it's not an element that that I particularly paid super attention to, and I kind of now wish that that maybe I did. I do remember seeing. It must have been some sort of bird of prey. I don't even know which one, but fly across and catch a fish in the river in front of us, and that was quite a moment. It was also one of the trips for me that really understood how lucky I was, having grown up in this country, because passing through, particularly, I was in some of the pristine jungle and around Kinabalu and places like that. Just incredibly poor, and like in that time, this was over 20 years ago. There was no running water. and you camped where you were sort of camping, and that was kind of quite a revelation for me. I was a I was probably about your age, a late teenager, seeing that. I don't know how you feel having experience of that and talking with sort of activists around the world. Any observation on your kind of global travels there?
I think, like, again, sorry, slightly off piece, but important. Like, something that was really important in terms of sort of the creation of Black to Nature was definitely like traveling and going to other countries, because it gave me a much broader, much more international perspective in terms of getting people into nature, how British people think about nature, why people aren't getting into nature. And something that was particularly significant to me was I went on a trip to Bangladesh. And I met so many Bangladeshi birders, naturalists, environmentalists, campaigners, who all really loved and cared about nature and the environment. And there wasn't a single one in the UK. And that was the moment where I realized that this wasn't like an international issue. Bangladeshi people don't just magically not care about nature. There is something very broad and very systemic going on within the UK or within Europe. And I think that that was definitely a massive turning point for me in terms of going about setting up Black to Nature. And I think, like, more on a general point, that international perspective almost always comes into play when I'm talking about the issues that I care about. Like, one thing within the UK that I'm very aware of is biodiversity loss, purely because I have been lucky enough to go to other countries, and it has absolutely put into perspective how little biodiversity and how little nature we have left in the UK. Which is one of the reasons that I personally feel like biodiversity loss is such an extreme issue. I also talk quite a lot about Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous people, and try to amplify Indigenous people's voices in terms of the climate change movement and the environmental movement and conservation, partially because, again, I have been lucky enough to go and visit these places and go and see their projects in action. And I became an ambassador for the organisation Survival International, which advocates for Indigenous people's rights against conservation organisations, because that is such a big issue in and of itself.
Yeah, I was reading there's a big project called Project Drawdown, which looks at some of the world's climate solutions, and they sort of list a sort of 50 or 100 of them, of which one of the most important is actually defending Indigenous land rights. If the Indigenous people look after their land and have done much better than usually other owners of land, so by giving them back their land rights, that's actually a huge positive climate solution that we could look towards. So maybe final question or so, wrapping up, is what other projects for the year or looking forward that you're kind of excited about? So we have your book, we have your podcast, we have another book coming up, and you're ambassador for various things. Anything else you'd like to highlight?
I think, like, genuinely the most, well, I guess there's two things. Like, firstly, Black to Nature is going really well. We've gotten loads of funding to run camps this summer, partially because of coronavirus and lockdown and the effect that's had on people. And we're going to be running so many camps this summer, and I'm very excited about it. So I think that that's going to be great. Like, we're going to be working with kids from London for the first time and things like that, and running longer camps. But I think on, like, a more personal level, the thing I'm most excited for this year is genuinely just going to university in the autumn. Because I've been on a gap year this year and I've been doing lots of working and stuff. But I've, same as everyone, I've been in lockdown. And I'm just really excited to go off and study and to live in a new place and all that sort of thing. And that's in October. So lots to look forward to this year.
Great, that sounds amazing. So do everyone look out for her book. We'll put links below. Black to Nature as well, if you're interested in any of the work that Mya's doing around that. And get birding for the podcast as well, if you want to find out any more about birds. So just leaves me to thank you very much. It was really great to speak to you, and I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to speak with you.
Great. Thanks. Bye.